They slapped me with a $30,000 fine for a cabin that wasn't even on HOA property. And when I proved it, things got very interesting. Picture this. I'm standing in my hand-built cedar cabin, morning coffee steaming in the crisp mountain air, holding a stack of legal documents that's about to turn my neighborhood upside down. The smell of fresh sawdust still lingered from my final trim work, mixed with the scent of pine needles crunching under my boots. That outrageous fine notice? It was sitting right there on my kitchen counter, demanding $30,000 for an unauthorized structure that was built 847 feet outside their jurisdiction. But here's what they didn't know about property lines, corrupt HOA boards, and what happens when you mess with a retired electrician who's got nothing left to lose. What would you do if your HOA tried to fine you for something on your own land? And hey, where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I bet you've got HOA horror stories too. My name's Garrett Steele, and 2 years ago I thought I had my retirement all figured out. 52 years old, 30 years as a union electrician, and a modest nest egg that would let me spend my golden years tinkering in the workshop with my wife Melody cheering me on from the kitchen window. Cancer had other plans. When Melody passed, I found myself rattling around our house in Pine Ridge Estates like a marble in an empty coffee can. The HOA-approved beige walls felt like they were closing in, and every perfectly manicured lawn reminded me of weekend projects we'd never finish together. That's when I remembered Uncle Ray's 40-acre plot up in the Colorado foothills, a slice of wilderness he'd left me that I'd barely visited since his funeral. The land sat about 300 yards past the last HOA street sign, where the manicured suburbia gave way to actual pine trees and deer trails. Standing there that first morning, breathing in the sharp scent of mountain air mixed with decomposing leaves, listening to the distant rumble of my diesel generator warming up, I knew exactly what I needed to build. A small cabin, nothing fancy, just a place where a man could drink his coffee without someone measuring his grass height. Now, 30 years of electrical work teaches you one thing above all else: always pull the proper permits first. I'd seen too many weekend warriors get burned by building without paperwork, so I marched straight down to the county office and filed for everything: structural, electrical, septic. Cost me an extra $300, but those little yellow permits would prove that 600-square-foot cabin was legal as Sunday morning church bells. That's where Vivian Hartwell enters our story. Vivian's the kind of woman who introduces herself by her HOA title first, like she's announcing royalty. HOA Board President Vivian Hartwell, she'd say, standing ramrod straight in designer pantsuits that probably cost more than my monthly pension. At 58, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd spent decades in corporate HR, and I swear she still had that predatory smile they teach you in Managing Difficult Employees seminars. She ran our 5-person HOA board like her personal kingdom. Pine Ridge Estates was her crowning achievement. Every mailbox painted the approved shade of forest green, every fence post exactly 6 feet high, every flower bed planted with her pre-approved species list. The woman actually carried a measuring tape in her purse. I'd seen her use it on neighbors' lawn decorations, which is either dedication or insanity, depending on your perspective. But Vivian had mastered what I call corporate condescension, that special tone that makes "have a blessed day" sound like a death threat. She'd smile that tight-lipped smile whenever she talked to me, always managing to work in little digs about maintaining our community standards, while her eyes said something entirely different about blue-collar retirees who didn't know their place. The morning everything changed, I was wrestling with a stubborn window frame when I heard the distinctive crunch of expensive tires on gravel. Vivian's pristine white Lexus pulled up to my property line, and out she stepped in ridiculous high heels that immediately started sinking into the soft forest floor. "Mr. Steele," she called out sweetly, picking her way toward me like she was navigating a minefield. "I do hope you've cleared this little project with the appropriate authorities." I gestured toward my bright yellow permit placard nailed to a nearby pine tree. "County says it's all legal, ma'am." Her smile faltered for just a second, barely a twitch, but I caught it. "Well, county permits are one thing. HOA approval is quite another. That should have been my first clue, but I was focused on getting that window level, and frankly, I figured any reasonable person would understand that HOA jurisdiction ended at the street signs. 2 weeks later, the certified letter arrived. $30,000 for a cabin built on land that predated her precious HOA by 15 years. Sitting there on my half-finished porch, bitter coffee growing cold in my hands, I read those final words. ignorance of our covenants is no excuse for flagrant violations. That's when I learned something important about bullies. They count on you being too tired to fight back. They counted wrong. The next morning, I did what any reasonable person would do. I called Vivian directly. No point letting this escalate when a simple conversation could clear things up. After all, we were neighbors, and neighbors should be able to work things out like civilized adults. Mrs. Hartwell, this is Garrett Steele. I got your letter about the cabin, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. The property is outside HOA boundaries. The pause on the other end stretched long enough for me to hear my coffee maker gurgling in the background, followed by what sounded suspiciously like paper shuffling. When she finally spoke, her voice had that same corporate sweetness that made my teeth ache. Mr. Steele, I appreciate your call, but our jurisdiction extends to all member properties regardless of their specific location. The covenants are quite clear on this matter. Ma'am, with respect, I've got county permits that show. I'm sure you do. However, our legal counsel has reviewed the situation thoroughly. The fine stands. Good day. Click. I stared at my phone for a solid minute, listening to the dial tone and wondering if I'd somehow slipped into an alternate universe where property lines were suggestions and HOA presidents ruled by divine right. The smell of burnt coffee snapped me back to reality. Apparently, righteous indignation doesn't prevent kitchen appliances from overheating. Within a week, Vivian launched what I can only describe as a psychological warfare campaign worthy of a Pentagon strategist. First came the complaint to county code enforcement, claiming I was operating an illegal rental property without proper permits. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was using my own permits against me, twisting legal construction into something nefarious. Then the whisper campaign started. I'd catch fragments of conversations at the grocery store, neighbors suddenly finding their shoelaces fascinating when I walked by. Poor man's clearly not thinking straight after his wife passed, I heard someone murmur in the cereal aisle. Grief does terrible things to people's judgment. Nothing quite like small-town gossip to make you feel like you're living in a fishbowl filled with piranhas. But Vivian's masterpiece was recruiting other homeowners as her personal surveillance network. Suddenly, every time I drove my truck toward the mountain road, someone would emerge from behind perfectly trimmed hedges like suburban ninjas, all carrying cell phones and concerned expressions. When I brought lumber deliveries up to the cabin site, neighbors would materialize from behind trees, snapping photos like I was some kind of exotic wildlife. The breaking point came when she had the audacity to show up at my front door with a clipboard and that predatory smile. "Garrett," she said, like we were old friends sharing afternoon tea, "I've been thinking about our little situation. Perhaps we can reach some accommodation." "I'm listening." "If you were to halt construction immediately and remove the existing structure, we might consider reducing the fine to a more manageable amount, say $5,000 for the administrative inconvenience." I looked at this woman standing on my porch, offering to graciously reduce her completely fabricated fine by 83%, and something inside me just shifted. You know that moment when you realize someone thinks you're stupid enough to fall for their con? That metallic taste you get when your blood pressure spikes and your ears start ringing? "Mrs. Hartwell," I said carefully, "I think it's time I did some research of my own." Her smile flickered like a light bulb with loose wiring. "Research? Property records, survey maps, maybe even those original HOA documents you keep mentioning." That Tuesday morning found me at the Jefferson County Courthouse, armed with coffee and determination. 30 years of dealing with building inspectors had taught me something valuable. Bureaucrats might be slow, but their paperwork never lies. Every property line, every easement, every covenant gets recorded and filed in triplicate, creating a paper trail more reliable than a bloodhound. The first surprise came when I found the original Pine Ridge Estates Incorporation documents. Turns out HOA boundaries aren't just gentlemen's agreements. They're legally defined and mapped, just like city limits, and they have to file precise boundaries with the county clerk when they incorporate. The second surprise was discovering that my Uncle Ray's 40 acres had been deeded and recorded 15 years before Pine Ridge Estates even broke ground. The land was what lawyers call grandfathered, existing property rights that can't be overridden by later agreements, no matter how fancy the letterhead. But the real bombshell was buried in the HOA's own covenant documents. Section 12C, subsection 4, stated in beautiful legal language that the association's authority extended only to properties within the platted boundaries as recorded with Jefferson County on March 15, 2008. I sat there in that courthouse basement, surrounded by the musty smell of old documents and the fluorescent hum of government lighting, reading that sentence 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. My cabin wasn't just outside their jurisdiction. It was legally impossible for them to have any authority over it. Time to hire a surveyor. Rex Morrison came recommended by the county clerk as someone who doesn't suffer fools gladly and knows property law like his own grandfather's fence posts. At 62, Rex had the weathered look of a man who'd spent 40 years arguing with property lines and winning more often than not. "Let me guess," he said when I explained the situation, adjusting his battered baseball cap. "HOA thinks they own everything they can see from their street signs?" "Something like that." Rex chuckled while setting up his equipment, the morning mist swirling around his transit scope like ghosts of old disputes. "Son, I've seen this movie before. These suburban kingdoms always think property lines are suggestions. GPS satellites don't lie, though. Neither does good old-fashioned surveying." 3 hours later, we had our answer, 847 feet. My cabin sat exactly 847 feet outside Pine Ridge Estate's legal boundary. I immediately sent certified copies of the survey to every board member, along with a polite letter requesting they withdraw their fine and issue a formal apology. Vivian's response came back within 48 hours. "Surveyor error, fine stands. Pay immediately or face property lien." That's when I realized this wasn't about property lines anymore. This was about power, control, and a woman who'd rather destroy a neighbor than admit she was wrong. A property lien on my house for a cabin that wasn't even in her jurisdiction. That threat hit different than the fine itself. The fine was theoretical money, painful but not life-destroying. A lien on my primary residence? That was my home, my equity, everything Melody and I had built together over 30 years. Vivian had just escalated from neighborhood nuisance to genuine threat. She wasn't done. Within a week, a sleek black sedan pulled into my driveway, and out stepped a man in a $1,000 suit carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. Behind him came Vivian, wearing her best concerned neighbor expression and clutching a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. "Mr. Steele," the suit said, extending a manicured hand, "I'm attorney Richard Blackwell from Blackwell, Morrison & Associates. We represent the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." I'd heard of their firm. They specialized in what they called community governance disputes, which was lawyer speak for crushing homeowners who stepped out of line. Their billboards along Highway 6 featured smiling attorneys standing in front of gated communities, with slogans like "Protecting Your Investment" and "Community Standards Matter." "We're here to discuss your unfortunate situation," Blackwell continued, popping open his briefcase with theatrical precision. "Mrs. Hartwell has shared her concerns about your construction project." The cease and desist order he handed me was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. 23 pages of whereas clauses and heretofores that boiled down to "Stop building immediately or we'll make your life miserable in ways you can't imagine." But here's where Vivian made her first tactical error. She got greedy. While Blackwell droned on about community harmony and property value protection, Vivian started her own little inspection tour of my yard. I watched through my kitchen window as she measured the distance between my fence and sidewalk with her trusty tape measure, took photos of my mailbox angle, and, I kid you not, counted the number of decorative rocks in my flower bed. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just about the cabin anymore. She was building a case for comprehensive violations, looking for any excuse to pile on additional fines. The woman was literally hunting for infractions like she was on some twisted HOA safari. The next morning brought a new certified letter. Apparently my mailbox was 2.3 inches too close to the sidewalk. Violation, $500. My fence stain was weathered beyond community standards. Violation, $750. And my truck, the same truck I'd been parking in my own driveway for 8 years, was now classified as a commercial vehicle prohibited in residential areas. Violation, $1,200. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents and violation notices, feeling like I was drowning in bureaucratic quicksand. The smell of fresh coffee couldn't quite mask the bitter taste of injustice settling in my mouth. That's when I remembered something my old union steward used to say. When management starts throwing around fancy lawyers, it's time to educate yourself about their game. Back to the courthouse I went, but this time with a different mission. If Vivian wanted to play by legal rules, I needed to understand exactly what those rules were. 3 days of digging through public records taught me something fascinating about HOA operations. They're required to file annual reports with the Colorado Secretary of State, including detailed financial statements. And boy, were those financial statements interesting. Pine Ridge Estates HOA collected roughly $180,000 annually in dues and fees. But their reported expenses told a curious story. Legal fees alone accounted for nearly $45,000 last year, 25% of their entire budget. For a community of 120 homes where the biggest controversy was usually Christmas decoration timing, that seemed excessive. Then I found the real nugget buried in their vendor payments. Blackwell, Morrison & Associates had received $67,000 over the past 18 months, supposedly for covenant enforcement activities. That worked out to about $3,700 per month in legal fees for a neighborhood where people mostly argued about lawn care. Either Pine Ridge Estates was the most litigation-heavy community in Colorado history, or someone was getting very comfortable spending other people's money on legal intimidation. I decided to test a theory. That evening, I knocked on doors throughout the neighborhood, armed with a simple question. Have you ever received legal threats from our HOA? The answers were eye-opening. Martha Henderson got fined $800 for planting roses instead of approved marigolds. Bob Schmidt faced a $1,500 penalty for installing a satellite dish that was visually disruptive. Jennifer Walsh received a cease and desist for running a home-based accounting business that violated commercial activity restrictions. Every single violation had resulted in expensive legal correspondence from Blackwell's firm. Every homeowner had ultimately paid rather than fight. The pattern was clear. Vivian had turned HOA enforcement into a revenue stream, with Blackwell as her collection agency. But here's what she didn't count on. I was retired, angry, and had nothing but time to dig deeper. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies, requesting a full audit of Pine Ridge Estates HOA's financial practices. Then I sent a certified letter to every homeowner in the community, detailing the legal fee expenditures and asking some pointed questions about where their money was really going. Vivian's response came swiftly. Another certified letter, this one threatening defamation charges for spreading false and malicious information about HOA operations. But something had changed. This time, her threats felt desperate rather than intimidating. She was running scared, and we both knew it. She was running scared, and we both knew it. But scared people in positions of power don't retreat. They double down. The next escalation came in the form of an emergency community meeting notice slipped under every door in Pine Ridge Estates. The subject line read, "Urgent, community safety concerns regarding rogue member actions." The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, with the agenda that made my blood pressure spike just reading it. Item number 1, discussion of member harassment and defamation activities. Item number 2, special assessment proposal to fund legal defense against frivolous complaints. Item 3, potential suspension of membership privileges for community disruption. Translation, Vivian planned to paint me as a dangerous troublemaker, stick every homeowner with a bill to fund her legal war chest, and try to kick me out of the HOA entirely, which, ironically, might have solved my original problem if it weren't for the fact that she was still claiming authority over my cabin. The woman had a gift for turning victory into defeat through sheer vindictiveness. I spent 3 days preparing for that meeting like a lawyer prepping for trial. Rex Morrison, bless his surveyor's heart, helped me create a visual presentation showing exactly where HOA boundaries ended and my property began. We printed aerial photos, boundary maps, and copies of those damning financial reports on foam boards that could be seen from the back row. Thursday evening arrived gray and drizzly, with the kind of persistent Colorado mist that makes everything smell like wet pine needles and approaching storms. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as neighbors filed in, many clutching copies of my letter about legal fee expenditures. I could see the division immediately. Vivian's supporters clustered near the front, shooting suspicious glances toward the growing group of homeowners who'd started asking uncomfortable questions about where their money went. Vivian opened the meeting wearing her most authoritative navy blazer and a smile that could have frozen coffee mid-pour. Thank you all for attending tonight's emergency session. We're here to address some serious concerns about a member who has chosen to disrupt our community harmony through harassment and false accusations. She gestured toward me like I was a particularly offensive piece of roadkill. Mr. Steele has been spreading misinformation about HOA finances and legal activities, apparently in retaliation for legitimate covenant enforcement. Tonight, we need to decide how to protect our community from this pattern of destructive behavior. That's when I stood up, foam boards in hand, and asked the question that changed everything. Mrs. Hartwell, before we discuss my alleged harassment, could you explain to everyone exactly where the HOA's legal authority begins and ends? Her confident expression flickered. Our authority extends to all member properties, as clearly stated in our covenants. I walked to the front of the room, unfolded my first display board, and pointed to the aerial photograph showing Pine Ridge Estate's platted boundaries highlighted in red. According to Jefferson County records, our legal jurisdiction ends here, at Granite Ridge Road. My cabin is located here. I pointed to a spot clearly outside the red boundary, 847 feet beyond our authority. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Martha Henderson, the woman who'd been fined for unauthorized roses, raised her hand. If Mr. Steele's cabin is outside our boundaries, why are we fining him for it? Vivian's voice took on that patronizing tone reserved for explaining obvious things to dim children. Property boundaries are more complex than simple survey lines, Martha. Our covenants include provisions for— No, interrupted a voice from the back. Rex Morrison had arrived, still wearing his work clothes and carrying a rolled-up document that crackled when he moved. Property boundaries aren't complex at all. They're legally defined, surveyed, and recorded. And this cabin sits on grandfathered land that predates your HOA by 15 years. The room erupted in conversations as Rex unrolled an official county survey map and spread it across the front table. Homeowners crowded around, pointing and asking questions, while Vivian stood frozen like a deer caught in headlights. That's when Bob Schmidt, the satellite dish victim, raised the nuclear question. Mrs. Hartwell, if we're spending $67,000 on legal fees to pursue illegitimate claims, what other covenant enforcement might be questionable? The floodgates opened. One by one, homeowners started sharing their own violation stories. Jennifer Walsh's home business restrictions that didn't exist in the original covenants. Tom Bradley's fence height requirements that contradicted county codes. Maria Santos's mailbox color mandate that wasn't in any official document. Every single case had generated expensive legal correspondence. Every homeowner had paid rather than fight. The pattern was unmistakable. Vivian had been manufacturing violations to generate revenue. "This is ridiculous," Vivian finally exploded, her composed facade cracking like old paint. "You people don't understand how difficult it is to maintain community standards when dealing with ungrateful homeowners who question every decision. These legal fees are necessary to protect your property values." The room fell silent. In that moment, every homeowner realized they were looking at someone who viewed them not as neighbors, but as subjects in her personal kingdom. Rex Morrison's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Ma'am, protecting property values doesn't require violating property rights, and it sure doesn't require spending other people's money on bogus lawsuits." That's when I played my final card. "Speaking of spending other people's money," I said, unfolding my last display board, "let's talk about what happened to the $23,000 collected for playground improvements that somehow never got built." Vivian went dead white. The revolution had begun. Vivian went dead white, and suddenly the room felt like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. That electric tension when everyone knows something big is about to happen. "That playground fund is being held in reserve pending contractor negotiations," she stammered, but her voice had lost its usual commanding authority. The words came out flat, rehearsed, like she'd practiced this excuse in front of a mirror. "For 3 years?" Bob Schmidt called out from the back. "My kids have been waiting for that playground since they were in kindergarten. They're in middle school now." That's when the most unexpected ally stepped forward. Josephine Carter, 78 years old and barely 5 feet tall, shuffled to the front of the room carrying a weathered cardboard box that looked like it had survived multiple garage sales. "Mrs. Hartwell," Josephine said in a voice that carried the authority of someone who'd lived through the Depression and wasn't impressed by corporate bullying, "I think it's time we discussed my late husband's files." The room went absolutely silent. Even the heating system seemed to hold its breath. "Harold was HOA treasurer for 12 years before his stroke," Josephine continued, setting the box on the front table with a thud that echoed like a judge's gavel. "He kept meticulous records, old habits from his accounting days, you know, bank statements, receipts, meeting minutes, correspondence, everything cross-referenced and filed by date. Vivian's face had progressed from white to a sickly green shade that reminded me of month-old cottage cheese. Mrs. Carter, I don't think private financial records are appropriate for— Oh, these aren't private, Josephine interrupted, lifting the box lid with the deliberate care of someone defusing a bomb. Harold always said HOA finances should be transparent as window glass. He gave copies of everything to the State Oversight Board every year, just like the law requires. She pulled out a thick manila folder labeled Discrepancies 2019 to 2022 in Harold's careful handwriting. You see, Harold noticed some irregularities before his stroke. Missing receipts, unexplained expenditures, payments to vendors that never provided services. He was planning to address these concerns at the 2022 annual meeting. The folder hit the table with a slap that made everyone jump. But then Harold had his stroke, and you, Mrs. Hartwell, volunteered to take over his duties during his recovery. Very generous of you. Very convenient. I watched Vivian's hands start to shake as Josephine spread Harold's meticulously organized documents across the table. Bank statements showing checks written to non-existent contractors. Invoices for legal services that cost 3 times the market rate. Payments to Pine Ridge Property Management LLC, a company that, according to Harold's research, existed only on paper and shared Vivian's home address. Harold spent his final months trying to reconcile these discrepancies, Josephine continued, her voice never rising above conversational level but somehow commanding absolute attention. He calculated approximately $47,000 in unexplained expenditures over 3 years. Money that should have gone to community improvements, snow removal, actual maintenance. The number hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. That's completely false, Vivian managed, but her voice cracked on the last word. Harold was confused after his stroke. These records are unreliable. Josephine's eyes turned arctic. My husband's mind was sharp as a tack until the day he died, young lady. Are you suggesting that 40 years of professional accounting experience suddenly evaporated because of a minor stroke? Rex Morrison leaned over the documents, his surveyor's eye picking up details others might miss. Ma'am, these bank records show systematic patterns. This isn't confusion. This is documentation of deliberate financial manipulation. The pieces started clicking together in my mind like tumblers in a lock. Vivian's aggressive pursuit of my cabin fine wasn't about property values or covenant enforcement. It was about generating cash flow to cover the money she'd already stolen. The manufactured violations, the excessive legal fees, the special assessments, all designed to replace funds she'd diverted to her own accounts. She hadn't been running an HOA, she'd been running a sophisticated embezzlement scheme, using legal intimidation to silence anyone who asked too many questions. And my refusal to pay that bogus $30,000 fine had threatened to expose the whole operation. The question now, Josephine said, closing Harold's folder with finality, is what we're going to do about it. That's when I realized this wasn't just about my cabin anymore. This was about justice for an entire community that had been systematically robbed by someone they'd trusted to protect their interests. The war was far from over. It was just beginning. The war was just beginning, but now I had an army. The meeting ended with Vivian storming out, muttering threats about elder abuse and malicious prosecution, while half the community center erupted in angry conversations about stolen money and violated trust. The other half sat in stunned silence, processing the reality that their HOA president had been systematically robbing them for years. Josephine Carter, bless her heart, invited everyone interested in pursuing justice to her house the following evening. I'll make coffee and we'll sort this mess out properly, she announced in that no-nonsense voice that had probably organized church potlucks and managed PTA fundraisers for decades. 23 homeowners showed up at Josephine's living room, transforming her cozy space into mission control for what Rex Morrison dubbed Operation Accountability. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the determined energy of people who'd finally had enough of being pushed around. Rex had brought reinforcements, specifically his friend Benjamin Cross, a retired attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and had a particular hatred for corrupt board members. At 65, Ben carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 40 years making bullies very uncomfortable in courtrooms. First things first, Ben said, spreading legal documents across Josephine's dining table like a general planning a campaign. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. From what I've seen tonight, Mrs. Hartwell has committed multiple felonies, including embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. He pointed to Harold's meticulously organized evidence. The beauty of financial crimes is that they leave paper trails. Every forged check, every fake invoice, every unauthorized transfer creates evidence that's admissible in both civil and criminal court. Martha Henderson raised her hand like she was back in school. What about those bogus fines she's been charging everyone? Are those illegal too? Absolutely, Ben replied with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting years to explain this particular legal concept. HOAs can only enforce legitimate covenants that actually exist in your recorded agreements. Manufacturing violations to generate revenue is fraud, plain and simple. That's when I learned something that should be taught in every civics class in America. HOAs are actually corporations, subject to state oversight and federal regulations just like any other business. They can't just make up rules and demand money any more than your local grocery store can suddenly decide you owe them rent for shopping there. Rex pulled out his laptop and started creating what he called our evidence inventory. We've got Harold's financial records, survey maps proving the cabin jurisdiction issue, and documented patterns of fraudulent enforcement. But we need more. Jennifer Walsh, the home business victim, volunteered to canvass every household in Pine Ridge Estates, documenting every questionable fine and violation notice from the past 3 years. If we're doing this, we're doing it right, she said with the determination of someone who'd been waiting years for revenge. Bob Schmidt offered his photography skills to document every supposed violation that Vivian had flagged, proving that most were either non-existent or based on made-up standards. Tom Bradley, being a retired IRS auditor, volunteered to cross-reference every HOA expenditure with actual community improvements. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. We'd simultaneously file complaints with 3 different agencies: the Colorado Secretary of State, Corporate Fraud, the Jefferson County District Attorney, Criminal Embezzlement, and the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies, HOA violations. Meanwhile, Ben would prepare a civil lawsuit to recover stolen funds and damages. The key, Ben explained while Josephine refilled coffee cups, is coordination. We hit them from multiple directions simultaneously so they can't focus their legal resources on any single front. But our secret weapon was something Vivian had never anticipated: community solidarity. Tom Bradley's accounting background meant our financial evidence would be bulletproof. Jennifer's organizational skills would ensure every homeowner's story was properly documented. Rex's surveying expertise would establish definitive property boundaries for any future disputes. And Josephine became our moral center, the living reminder that we were fighting for more than money. We were fighting for the principle that neighbors shouldn't steal from neighbors, and positions of trust shouldn't become opportunities for theft. The most satisfying part of our planning session came when Rex suggested we install security cameras around all our properties. If Vivian's desperate enough to steal $47,000, she's desperate enough to try intimidation or sabotage, he warned. Sure enough, we didn't have to wait long to test that theory. 3 days later, while I was putting the finishing touches on my cabin's front porch, savoring the smell of fresh wood stain and the satisfying sound of my hammer driving the final nails, I heard the distinctive crunch of footsteps on gravel. My new security camera caught a figure in dark clothing attempting to damage my generator with a crowbar. The expensive hiking boots were a dead giveaway. Vivian had graduated from legal intimidation to actual sabotage. But unlike her previous victims, I was ready. We all were. The footage went straight to the sheriff's department with copies to our attorney and the district attorney's office. Criminal charges for vandalism and trespassing were filed within 24 hours. More importantly, the community rally that followed proved that Vivian's reign of terror was officially over. Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak up for years suddenly found their voices, sharing stories of harassment and illegal fines that painted a picture of systematic abuse. The hunter had become the hunted. The hunter had become the hunted, and Vivian was beginning to realize just how cornered she'd become. The vandalism charges hit her like a sledgehammer to her carefully constructed reputation. Within hours of the sheriff's visit, the story spread through Pine Ridge Estates faster than wildfire in August. The woman who'd spent years lecturing neighbors about community standards had been caught on camera destroying property with a crowbar like some common criminal. But instead of backing down, Vivian doubled down with the desperation of someone watching their entire world collapse. If I thought criminal charges would humble her, I was about to learn how dangerous a cornered narcissist could become. Her first move was hiring a crisis management firm. Apparently, there are actually companies that specialize in cleaning up the messes of corrupt HOA officials. Within 48 hours, anonymous flyers started appearing on car windshields throughout the neighborhood, claiming I was a mentally unstable grieving widower who'd been harassing board members and threatening community safety. The flyers were professionally printed, complete with graphics and bullet points about my pattern of aggressive behavior. They even included quotes from concerned neighbors describing my obsessive vendetta against legitimate HOA governance. The whole thing read like political attack ads designed by someone who'd studied psychological warfare. But Vivian's masterstroke was the social media campaign. Fake Facebook profiles started posting in local community groups, sharing carefully crafted stories about my erratic behavior and threats against board members. The posts were subtle enough to avoid obvious defamation, but persistent enough to plant seeds of doubt about my credibility. Rex Morrison found the first fake profile when his daughter tagged him in a post about dangerous homeowners who threaten property values. The profile claimed to belong to concerned Pine Ridge resident Sarah Johnson, but Rex's reverse image search revealed the profile photo belonged to a stock photography model from Nebraska. "She's trying to control the narrative before our evidence goes public," Ben Cross observed when we gathered at Josephine's house to review the attack campaign. "It's actually a smart strategy. Discredit the messenger before people hear the message." That's when we discovered just how deep Vivian's corruption network ran. Tom Bradley's forensic accounting had uncovered something that made our original embezzlement allegations look like petty theft. The fake Pine Ridge Property Management LLC that had been receiving HOA payments wasn't just Vivian's personal piggy bank. It was connected to a web of shell companies and kickback schemes involving local contractors, legal firms, and even county officials. "Look at this pattern," Tom said, spreading bank records across Josephine's dining table like he was assembling a jigsaw puzzle. Every major HOA contract for the past 3 years went to companies that paid substantial consulting fees to Pine Ridge Property Management. Lawn care, snow removal, community maintenance, everything was inflated by 30–40% to generate kickback revenue. The numbers were staggering. What we'd initially thought was $47,000 in missing funds was actually closer to $180,000 in systematic fraud. Vivian hadn't just been stealing HOA money. She'd been running a comprehensive corruption scheme that artificially inflated every community expense to generate personal profit. But here's where things got really interesting. Jennifer Walsh's door-to-door documentation project had uncovered something that connected our little neighborhood drama to a much bigger story. 3 other HOAs in Jefferson County had reported similar patterns of excessive legal fees, manufactured violations, and mysterious cost overruns, all connected to the same network of contractors and legal firms. "We're not dealing with one corrupt HOA president," Ben realized as the scope became clear. "We're looking at organized fraud that extends across multiple communities. This is a federal case waiting to happen." That's when Vivian made her most desperate move yet. The emergency meeting notice appeared under our doors on a Friday evening, calling for a special assessment vote to fund necessary legal defense against frivolous complaints and harassment lawsuits. The proposed assessment? $2,500 per household payable immediately to protect community assets from malicious litigation. The meeting was scheduled for Monday night, barely enough notice to organize opposition, and time to catch people off guard before they could fully understand what they were voting on. But Vivian had miscalculated our community's awakening. Instead of panicking about emergency legal fees, homeowners started asking pointed questions about why we needed $300,000 to defend against frivolous complaints that seemed to have substantial evidence behind them. The email chain that followed was a thing of beauty. Martha Henderson started it with a simple question. "Has anyone actually seen evidence that Mr. Steele's complaints are frivolous?" Within hours, 23 homeowners had responded with their own stories of questionable fines, excessive fees, and suspicious contractor relationships. By Sunday evening, it was clear that Vivian's emergency assessment would fail spectacularly. Not only would homeowners vote it down, but the very act of calling for it had created the perfect forum for presenting our evidence to the entire community. That's when she played her final, most desperate card. The anonymous tip to Child Protective Services claimed that my unstable mental state and obsessive behavior made me a danger to neighborhood children. The complaint alleged that I'd been stalking families and making threats that created an unsafe environment for minors. It was a masterpiece of malicious manipulation, designed to trigger an investigation that would tie me up in bureaucratic hell for months while destroying my reputation in the community. But like all of Vivian's schemes, it was based on lies that couldn't withstand scrutiny. And by now, scrutiny was something we'd gotten very good at providing. The CPS investigation lasted exactly 4 hours. The caseworker, a tired-looking woman named Janet Sullivan, who'd probably seen every flavor of neighbor revenge in her 20-year career, showed up at my door Tuesday morning with the weary expression of someone processing her third bogus complaint of the week. "Mr. Steele, I'm here about a report concerning potential safety issues involving children in your neighborhood." I invited her in for coffee and laid out the entire situation: the HOA corruption, the fraudulent fines, Vivian's escalating desperation, and our community's efforts to expose systematic theft. Janet took notes while I showed her the security footage of Vivian vandalizing my property, Harold Carter's financial records, and the documented pattern of manufactured violations. "Let me guess," Janet said after reviewing the evidence. "The person who filed this complaint is the same one facing potential criminal charges for embezzlement?" "That would be correct." She closed her notebook with a snap that sounded like a judge's gavel. "Mr. Steele, in my experience, people who steal money from their neighbors rarely have genuine concerns about child safety. Consider this case closed." But Janet's visit triggered something I hadn't expected: media attention. Apparently, false CPS reports filed as retaliation for exposing HOA corruption make for compelling human interest stories. By Thursday morning, a reporter from Denver Channel 7 was calling my phone, asking if I'd be willing to discuss HOA abuse and community corruption for their weekend investigative segment. That's when Vivian made her most catastrophic error in judgment. Instead of laying low while criminal investigations proceeded, she decided to fight fire with gasoline. She called her own press conference, scheduled for Friday afternoon at the Pine Ridge Estates Community Center, announcing her intention to address malicious rumors and defend community integrity against harassment campaigns. The woman actually thought she could control media narrative through sheer force of personality. Rex Morrison and I arrived an hour early to find Vivian setting up a makeshift podium, complete with printed talking points and what appeared to be a professionally prepared slideshow about maintaining property values through strong governance. She'd even arranged folding chairs in neat rows, like she was hosting a corporate board meeting instead of defending herself against embezzlement charges. "This should be interesting," Rex muttered as we watched her practice her opening remarks in front of a mirror she'd propped against the wall. The local media turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. Channel 7's investigative team brought cameras and a producer who'd clearly done her homework about HOA corruption scandals. The Denver Post sent their community affairs reporter, armed with questions about financial transparency in residential associations. Even the weekly Jefferson County Journal showed up, sensing a story that would resonate with their suburban readership. But the real surprise was community attendance. Instead of the handful of loyal supporters Vivian had expected, nearly 80 homeowners packed the community center, many carrying copies of Harold Carter's financial documentation and their own violation notices. Vivian opened with confidence, reading from prepared remarks about dedicated volunteer service and protecting community investments from frivolous attacks. She painted herself as a victim of harassment, describing my legitimate property boundary complaints as obsessive vendetta behavior from someone clearly struggling with grief-related mental health issues. The first crack in her facade appeared when Channel 7's reporter asked a simple question. "Mrs. Hartwell, can you explain why the HOA paid $23,000 to a property management company that shares your home address?" Vivian's practiced smile faltered. Those are complex financial arrangements that wouldn't be appropriate to discuss in this forum." "What about the playground fund?" called out Bob Schmidt from the audience. "Where did that money go?" "Financial details are confidential board matters," Vivian snapped, her composure slipping like makeup in summer heat. That's when Josephine Carter stood up in the front row, clutching Harold's folder like a weapon. "Mrs. Hartwell, nothing about HOA finances should be confidential from the homeowners who pay for them." The room erupted as homeowners started shouting questions about their own violation fines, excessive legal fees, and mysterious special assessments. Vivian tried to maintain control, but 78 angry neighbors demanding answers about stolen money isn't something you manage with corporate speak and deflection. The coup de grace came when Jennifer Walsh raised her hand and asked the question that destroyed Vivian's entire narrative. If Mr. Steele's complaints are frivolous harassment, Why did you try to vandalize his property with a crowbar? Dead silence. The kind of silence that falls when everyone suddenly realizes they're watching someone's world collapse in real time. Vivian's face cycled through confusion, anger, and panic before settling on desperate fury. That's completely false. This entire meeting is a setup orchestrated by people who want to destroy community governance. The Channel 7 cameras captured every word as she continued her meltdown, accusing homeowners of conspiracy and elder abuse for questioning financial irregularities. She demanded that media leave immediately, threatened to sue anyone who repeated malicious lies, and finally stormed toward the exit while shouting about ungrateful residents who didn't appreciate her years of dedicated service. But she never made it to the door. Sheriff's Deputy Martinez was waiting in the lobby with an arrest warrant for grand theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The cameras rolled as Vivian Hartwell was handcuffed and led away, her corporate composure finally cracking completely as she screamed about frame jobs and malicious prosecution. The revolution was complete. Justice had arrived with handcuffs and camera crews. But the real climax was just beginning. The arrest footage went viral within hours. By Saturday morning, HOA President embezzlement arrest was trending on social media across Colorado, with news outlets picking up the story as far away as California and Florida. Apparently, corrupt HOA officials getting their comeuppance strikes a nerve with frustrated homeowners everywhere. But Vivian's arrest was just the opening act. The main event came the following Tuesday at the emergency HOA meeting called to address what the county prosecutor was now calling systematic financial fraud affecting multiple residential communities. The Pine Ridge Estates Community Center had never seen anything like it. The parking lot overflowed with cars, news vans, and curious neighbors from surrounding developments who'd heard about our little revolution. Inside, every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and crowding near the windows like they were watching a championship fight. Sheriff's Deputy Martinez attended in an official capacity, along with representatives from the Colorado Secretary of State's office and the FBI's white-collar crime unit. Turns out our neighborhood drama had uncovered what federal investigators called a multi-jurisdictional conspiracy involving HOA corruption, contractor fraud, and money laundering. The meeting opened with Benjamin Cross presenting our evidence to the packed room. Harold Carter's meticulously organized financial records were projected on screens for everyone to see. Bank statements showing payments to fake companies, forged signatures on community checks, and documentation of systematic theft totaling $180,000 over 3 years. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben announced to the silent crowd, what we're looking at isn't just embezzlement. This is organized fraud that turned your homeowners association into a criminal enterprise. The gasps from the audience sounded like a collective exhale of people finally understanding how thoroughly they'd been robbed. Martha Henderson started crying when she realized her Rose Garden fine had helped fund Vivian's vacation to the Bahamas. Bob Schmidt's face turned red with rage as he calculated how much his family had paid in bogus violations over the years. But the real bombshell came when Rex Morrison presented his investigation into the broader corruption network. Using public records and financial documents, he'd traced connections between Vivian's scheme and similar operations in 4 other Colorado communities. Pine Ridge Estates wasn't an isolated case, Rex explained, pointing to a complex chart showing money flows between shell companies and contractor kickbacks. This was part of a sophisticated operation that systematically defrauded homeowners across Jefferson County. That's when FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres stepped forward to address the crowd. At 45, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 20 years making white-collar criminals very uncomfortable. Based on evidence provided by your community investigation, Agent Torres announced, we've opened a federal case involving racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that extend far beyond your neighborhood. This morning, we executed search warrants at 17 locations and arrested 6 individuals connected to this criminal enterprise. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as people realized their little HOA dispute had uncovered a federal case involving millions of dollars in stolen community funds. But the moment that made everything worthwhile came when Josephine Carter took the microphone. At 78 years old, she'd become the unlikely hero of our story, and her words carried the moral weight of someone who'd seen enough corruption to last several lifetimes. Harold always said that democracy works when good people stand up to bullies, she began, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. For 3 years we let fear keep us quiet while someone stole from our community. But this week proved that when neighbors work together, justice isn't just possible, it's inevitable. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. The formal votes that followed were anticlimactic after the emotional release of Josephine's speech. Vivian and the entire corrupt board were removed unanimously. Emergency elections were scheduled for the following month. All bogus fines and fees were officially voided, with the promise that recovered funds would be returned to affected homeowners. Most importantly, the community adopted what became known as the Pine Ridge Transparency Covenant, a set of governance rules requiring monthly financial reports, open book audits, and homeowner approval for any legal expenditures over $500. But my personal vindication came when the new interim board president, elected by acclamation from the floor, made an official announcement. The $30,000 fine against Garrett Steele is hereby voided, with the board's formal apology for the harassment and illegal enforcement actions taken by the previous administration. The applause was nice, but the real satisfaction came from something simpler. Walking out of that community center, breathing the crisp mountain air mixed with the scent of approaching snow, I realized that my little cabin project had become something much bigger than personal healing. It had become a symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to be bullied by corrupt authority. As I drove home past the community center, I could see people still gathered in small groups, sharing stories and making plans for rebuilding their neighborhood's governance. The sound of genuine community conversation, punctuated by laughter and hope, drifted through my truck windows like music. For the first time since Melody's death, I felt like I was part of something larger than my own grief. The healing had begun. The healing had begun, and it spread through our community like wildfire in the best possible way. 6 months later, Vivian Hartwell was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for racketeering, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The judge's comments during sentencing captured what many of us felt. The defendant violated the fundamental trust that communities place in their elected representatives, turning a position of service into an opportunity for personal enrichment. The federal investigation ultimately recovered $2.3 million in stolen funds across 5 HOA communities, with Pine Ridge Estates receiving $247,000 in restitution, far more than we'd originally calculated. Turns out Vivian's network had been even more sophisticated than we'd imagined, involving fake maintenance contracts, inflated insurance policies, and kickback schemes that stretched back nearly a decade. But the real transformation wasn't measured in recovered dollars. It was visible in the way our neighborhood came alive again. The new HOA board, elected in a landslide vote for transparency and accountability, implemented financial reforms that became a model for communities across Colorado. Monthly budget reports, public contractor bidding, and homeowner approval for all major expenditures turned our association from a dictatorship into an actual democracy. The playground that Vivian's embezzlement had prevented was finally built using recovered funds, but we named it something special, the Harold Carter Memorial Playground, honoring the man whose meticulous record-keeping had made justice possible. Josephine cried happy tears at the dedication ceremony, watching neighborhood children play on equipment that corruption had stolen, but community action had restored. My cabin, meanwhile, became something I'd never expected, a symbol of resistance that neighbors would point out to visitors as the place where the HOA revolution started. The irony wasn't lost on me that a simple grief project had accidentally sparked a federal investigation and reformed local governance practices. But the most meaningful transformation was personal. Building that cabin had started as therapy for loss, but fighting for it had given me purpose again. Rex Morrison and I turned our collaboration into a formal business, Boundary Solutions LLC, helping homeowners across Colorado navigate property disputes and HOA corruption. Turns out there's significant demand for people who know how to read survey maps and aren't afraid of bullies. Josephine Carter became my unofficial business partner, using her decades of community organizing experience to help other neighborhoods build coalitions against corrupt boards. At 79, she discovered a new calling as what local media dubbed the HOA whistleblower, traveling to communities where homeowners suspected financial irregularities. The ripple effects extended far beyond our little corner of Jefferson County. The Colorado legislature passed the Pine Ridge Reform Act, requiring stricter financial oversight for homeowners associations and creating whistleblower protections for residents who report suspected corruption. Similar legislation was introduced in 6 other states, all citing our case as evidence that HOA governance needed fundamental reform. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was watching our community rediscover the meaning of neighborly cooperation. The monthly HOA meetings that had once been exercises in intimidation became actual discussions about community priorities. Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak up for years found their voices, sharing ideas for improvements that would benefit everyone rather than enrich a select few. The annual Pine Ridge Community Festival, funded with recovered embezzlement money, became a celebration of what ordinary people can accomplish when they work together. Local news crews still show up every year to document what they call the HOA that fought back. But for us, it's just become normal life in a functional democracy. As I write this, I'm sitting on my cabin's front porch, listening to the sound of children playing in Harold Carter Memorial Playground and breathing air that smells like pine needles and possibility. The morning coffee tastes different when you're drinking it in a place you built with your own hands and defended through your own courage. Melody would have loved seeing our community come together like this. She always believed that good people could overcome any challenge if they supported each other through the tough times. Turns out she was right. The cabin walls are decorated now with photos from our victory celebration, newspaper clippings about the federal investigation, and thank you letters from homeowners in other states who used our story to fight their own corrupt boards. But my favorite decoration is simple: Josephine's handwritten note that says, "Harold would be proud." So here's what I learned from taking on a corrupt HOA and accidentally starting a federal investigation. Bullies count on you being too tired, too scared, or too isolated to fight back. But when you stand up, document everything, and build coalitions with neighbors who share your values, even the most entrenched corruption can't survive community scrutiny. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment sharing your worst HOA nightmare. Trust me, you're not alone in dealing with power-hungry board members who've forgotten they're supposed to serve their communities, not rule them. And if you love seeing bullies get their comeuppance through good old-fashioned community organizing, hit that subscribe button. Next week, I'm sharing the story of how I helped my elderly neighbor get revenge on the contractor who tried to scam her out of her life savings. Because sometimes, fighting back isn't just about personal justice. It's about protecting the people who can't protect themselves.
Thanks for watching HOA Stories. If this episode made you laugh or shake your head at HOA madness, hit that like button and drop your opinion below. We post HOA Karen Chaos and Neighborhood Showdowns every week, so be sure to subscribe to catch the next unbelievable story.